Well, good afternoon to all of you. And let me add my own gratitude to what Rani has said. That indeed, very grateful that notwithstanding the current ongoing parliament session, notwithstanding the fact that you have commenced your pre-budget preparations today, you have found time for a few minutes to be with us. So let me ask you the first question, that considering that the all global indicators from global financial institutions, from the International Monetary Fund, from the World Bank, from Asian Development Bank, an independent assessment is that India, looking at the symmetry of its overall macroeconomic policy with ongoing structural reforms, is one of the brightest spots in the global economy at a time when there are geopolitical uncertainties and uncertainties of other kinds. How do you see the not only the growth prospects for the current fiscal year, and sometimes one can get too bottled up with the current to lose sight of just beyond an episode. How do you see the growth prospects for the Indian economy this year and going beyond that in the medium term?
Thank you very much, and thank you, India-Japan Center, and also the Ananta Center to have me over again this year. I value this interaction, and I think quite a lot of things are discussed here which play in our minds when we are sitting around talking about policy. So there is no way in which this session is something which we would bypass, ignore, or even not give a keen attention to. So more than happy to be here. To the question, NK, if I can refer to you so. There's always this question about India. Do you think you'll be able to keep up the growth momentum? There's always this question about India. Is this sustainable? And immediately also this temptation to say, and right temptation to say, global growth is this way, global demand is that way, trade is happening this way. And despite all that, do you think you'll grow? Very legitimate concerns. And I would honestly concede that these are issues which we seriously take on board to see how best we can keep our position. The global situation is something which all of you are familiar with, but broad pointers is what I'm going to place here before you all. The demand globally, particularly of the developed countries, has tabled out. And if it is plateauing, prospects for India, like countries which depend so much on exporting, not just commodities like old age India or decades ago India, but today we are into big time exports of engineering goods, exports of well-processed goods, also high precision goods. So for us, if there is a plateauing of demand, particularly in developed countries, it's a matter of concern. Equally, for agriculture and its products, climate change is also bearing heavily upon us. We have a big market to take care of, and therefore, agriculture and some commodities which have always found market globally, climate-related concerns weigh heavily, there's no doubt. Third, in traditional areas where we had strength, whether it is intensive labor-producing items, labor-intensive export items, whether it is textiles or lately well-developed into sophisticated manufacturing of footwear and so on, we still have a challenge because the demand, as I said, which is saturating, is not giving you the value addition. It's not giving that marginal additional benefit out of export. So if global consumption is plateauing, there is a concern. But equally, we see opportunities because not just newer markets, but even within these markets, there is also a shift in terms of production and therefore cost cutting measures. And therefore, if technology is coming in one way, another is also looking at the cost of technologies itself. So India has opportunities as much as its share of challenges. But with all this said, and with the domestic market also now growing in terms of GDP and also in terms of PPP, if you look at it, the purchasing power of Indians is improving, but within India, you'll also have concerns about wages saturating. We are quite seized of these factors which might have a play on India's own consumption. But I can place before you similarities with 2019, an election year, with 2024, an election year, where the focus in the first quarter has gone for election and election management. So it's not just the political parties which are worried about elections and spend a lot of time in election management, but administrations, both of the state and of the center, give a lot of time in getting through with the electoral process. And natural governance related, public expenditure related activities come to the back burner. And as a result, that which will have to be a catalyst for triggering better consumption, more demand for core products, and so on, sort of become slower, and which you saw in quarter two growth numbers. Quarter one, the election, but quarter four, which was very good, had an impact on quarter one. So the numbers were not alarming when you saw it. But quarter two, when it slows down and when growth numbers are reflecting, we should put it in the context of an economy, a governance structure, which was all focused on election. And therefore, quarter one's emphasis more on running the election through had a bearing on quarter two. But I'm elaborating this just to say it's not a systemic slowdown. It is more absence of activity on public expenditure, capital expenditure, and so on. So I expect quarter three to also make up for all this. So the growth number is something which is not necessarily going to get badly affected. We need to also push up on very many other factors. So I would think India still, not just for this year, but for the next year as well, and the year after that also, very good chances and opportunities for India to remain as the fastest growing economy.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for placing the anecdotal event, so to say, of the numbers of 5.4, which you have talked about in the broader context and the circumstances which really led to it. Me, in the same context, ask you a question which is very specific to Indo-Japanese relationship. The fact remains that the Japanese direct foreign investment is nowhere near its potential, particularly in small and medium sectors. Earlier issues have been raised on regulatory concerns, on approval processes. And here, if I might add, the need for state governments to act in concert with the central government, which is a very important part of our story given the federal matrix. So I think that it would be very good for the potential Japanese investors to be able to have your presence to say on what more can be done, perhaps from our side, to ease these regulatory burdens, the approval processes, to bring about a greater harmony between the actions of the central government and the state government.
Thank you. And I think this is a very important question in the context of any investment, and more so in the context of the Japanese investment. I'd like to differentiate between Japanese investments in some states, even now, being more at a level of comfort in some states because there's greater, if I may use the word, chemistry between Japanese administration, Japanese investors, and Japanese businesses in some states only because they've been there for some time and they've got used to some states. Whereas familiarity is not prevalent with many other states. That's not to say only chemistry works. It's very important, and I underline the fact that regulatory ease is necessary both at the center and at the state level. And I personally would, through the industries department with Government of India, would give a lot of attention for center and states to work together to remove the hurdles which prevail and also the tight-fistedness with which some of the regulators in the state levels operate in terms of, where they should ease it out a bit more, they still hold on to restrictions. So I would think that's a very pertinent concern, and I'm quite uh, appreciative of the fact that you've raised it. And we need to work together. And I think both center and state will, at least in case by case cases, pick it up and work to have less regulatory control, more facilitation. And I will certainly give my time for it.
Thank you. Moving on now, since the time which you have spared is now short, moving on to some other areas, let me ask you, looking at the current uncertainties and some important events which have taken place, you have personally played a very important role in the initiatives under the G20 presidency of India for the reform of the international financial architecture. You also had very close interaction during that process because the G7 presidency rested at that time with Japan. What would be your broad take on the progress which we have made on broadly reforming the international financial architecture to give it predictability, to give the multilateral institutions the kind of fillip for them to play a more important role for global good?
I think this is a very pertinent issue. And I can, from my experience, say that when Japan takes the initiative, being a very important member of the G7, with a certain fastidiousness, you see that it reaches the logical conclusion. And this is not just a hearsay. I've seen how during India's presidency, in handling the Sri Lankan crisis, how Japan came forward to work together with the World Bank and IMF to have a meeting of all the creditors and take the initiative to make sure that Sri Lanka is not going to wait for too long and resolution should happen within reasonable time. And it bore very good results. I commend that initiative of Japan. And that need not be limited only to Sri Lanka. It need not be limited only to resolving debt crisis of countries with which Japan or India has had some relationship. I think with the heft of Japanese overseas assistance, which happens in different parts of the world, Japan should play that role every time in the G7 and every time it matters. And in that, not as a part of G7, but as certainly a part of G20, India would happily do its bit. That initiative actually gave a lot of substance to the initiative which India presidency took in reforming multilateral development banks, in which N.K. Singh and Lawrence Summers were the coordinators of the team, which brought in experts from all over the world, looking at what is necessary for the World Bank or global multilateral institutions to take as reformatory steps so that they become 21st century ready. And the kind of reform discussions which this committee, high level experts committee, discussed and then gave it to the G20 India presidency, which I'm happy to say the Brazilians are carrying forward during their presidency, is so full of substance that the World Bank, which was going through its evolution plan anyway, and which had initiated somewhat the evolution plan even when India's presidency commenced, found it fit to accept 27 of the 30 recommendations given by the high level experts committee. So that is the kind of contribution this global experts team did, which Brazil happily also contributed and took forward. And that has a big message for multilateral development financial institutions, that unless they're going to look at their own functioning and function like a global efficient bank, which has development and poverty removal as an agenda, which is what is essentially World Bank, but also many other regional multilateral development banks which have come, AIIB, ADB, NDB, and so on. All of us have a role in being efficient, in being professionally run, in taking today's concerns, not just poverty alleviation, not just development, climate finance, which N.K. Singh's committee rightly put it as global public goods. We need to have greater readiness of banks. Otherwise, today's challenges are not just 20th century challenges. We have newer challenges. We have had a pandemic. Global climate conditions are really impacting all of us. Island nations are facing all the tragedy. And funds are not coming otherwise. 100 billion or what happened in Baku are all before us. So there is a role which all of us need to play. And I look up to Japan as a very important G7 member who, when coming forward, can make a difference to play that role of difference.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the warm words which you have mentioned about the work of the independent expert group. Let me ask you one question which may be somewhat more personal from that point of view. Let me ask you that we have just passed through a pandemic. Hopefully, this is firmly behind us. And looking back retrospectively, the world is interested to know how, as the finance minister, during that critical period when there was so many demands, pressures, pulls, did you manage to achieve not only a remarkable symmetry between monetary and fiscal policy, but used that challenge to put through a slew of reforms, some of which were very far-reaching. Not many, for instance, know that embedded in those huge list of items was subject which was an untouchable subject post-independence, namely the shrinking role of the public sector to only confine itself to strategic areas. How did this balancing take place, which to some extent the world has wondered and has certainly acclaimed?
Well, I think it is also derived from the fact that you've had a prime minister who looked at opportunities in each of the challenge. Every time there is a challenge before us, it was not just seen as a challenge which we have to overcome with some kind of a focused attention, but he also saw the opportunities that challenge gave him. And during the COVID, as much as the world was looking for vaccines, for making sure the people don't suffer, for making sure that every citizen gets something in his hand to take care of himself and his family, every small unit had some resources so that they are not shutting the shop or throwing people out of job. As much as all these took his attention, the challenge was seen as a time for opportunity for reforms. 5 mini budgets were presented during that time, each of them giving relief, support, hand holding on the one hand, and on the other, making sure that small and overlooked long pending reforms were also taken up. One such a reform, which I think was a major step forward for India to have ideological clarity, particularly in economic matters, was to say governance, which is a one line philosophy, which our party, my party, Prime Minister belongs to the party, all of us belong to that party, strongly believe in minimum governance and minimum government and maximum governance. So government doesn't have to be prevalent and present in areas which you didn't have to be in. And therefore, at that time, we took this call after quite a lot of discussion that this is the opportune moment to bring that clarity in our economic ideological thinking into governance. We had that clarity as a party, but we wanted that to come into governance. And therefore, that was the opportune moment to announce that government will be present in core strategically important areas. But no area will be banned or prohibited for private sector. Therefore, every area was opened up for private sector, which I thought was just so timely that you're seeing the benefit, reaping the benefit of that policy. If I can take the example of the space sector, it was opened up. You saw the investments which have come in. India had the lead advantage even then, even before, in space, but we are now able to leverage that for the benefit of Indian startups, young people who want to contribute from outside of the government for space sector, and so on.
Well, with the assurance which is embedded in your answer of the continued symmetry of overall macroeconomic policies and monetary fiscal policies with continuation of structural reforms, the medium-term growth outlook obviously looks rather optimistic. If I may take you back for a minute, many of these far-reaching reforms which you had announced on factors of production, particularly on labor, on capital, on land, are areas which are in the domain of the states. What do you think would be an appropriate strategy to be able to incentivize or to persuade the states that it is in their long-term interest too to be able to carry forward the changes in the factors of production, which would enable India to catapult from a 7% growth to a higher percentage, consistent with our vision of a developed India to 1947.
This is actually the pulse that we can feel. All of us are able to recognize the issue. As it is, some of the states which feel the need for keeping in alignment with the center's open policy, facilitative policy, less bureaucratic policy, enabling business kind of a policy. Many states have already felt the need for it and they're coming forward, and you can see investments getting attracted to those states. It's incumbent, and I would think it is important for the center, the government of India, in a federal structure, to engage with states which need that kind of a hand-holding, to understand the importance of this kind of a competitive world, this kind of a benefit that the state can derive when it opens up, when it eases out on such regulatory and also for becoming highly competitive. I find many states today wanting to work with the center to understand how to go about this process, and we are happy to extend the facilitation. But greater engagement is required for those particular factors of production related reforms which will have to be undertaken. Some states which have come forward are doing it quietly, not to imply that the reforms are bad, quietly to imply that they agree with the benefits which will accrue once the reform is taken up. So they do it at their level, but and also are able to see the benefits coming through for them. But there are other states for whom probably politically it is still something which has to be taken up for later, not now. But in the interest of the country and in the interest of the momentum that economy will have to have, we are talking with very many states to see where their difficulties arise from. So this engagement will continue. We will talk with the states. We will take them on board to take it forward.
Thank you very much. One final question. In an increasingly fractured world, looking at the emerging uncertainties of multiple kinds, and compared to the fact that we have, fortunately, a very stable political leadership committed to structural reforms and changes, what do you see in the global rebalancing of economic power would be the role of Asia, and in that role, the leadership of India for the global South?
Well, this question would compel me to talk not just of India, but of Japan as well. Because I think in the global reset and in the way in which countries, because of the challenges which are arising, and because of the connect that India has with the global South, historically, economically, and also having been the voice of the global South for some time, I think India will carry forward its role, which is what you saw through the G20 presidentship. And also, every time Prime Minister takes up an issue of global importance, he does consult with the global South and takes that voice to speak about their concerns as well. We've been consciously doing it for quite some time. Now, why do I bring in Japan into it? I think now the global South is not just going to be the same as before, because you find that technology, aspirations of the people, the needs of an economy, as you would speak about like India, and if you were to speak about Japan simultaneously, becoming even more complementary. There is a need for, let us say, Japan and India to play this role. I mean, I again go back to talking about the initiative in the G7 that Japan takes up for representing causes in which you are aligned. I would think there is a need to align even wider. And that alignment is when you see technology and its use and the value that use will give you. So I'll extend that argument to say, if India and its global South is an audience, India and global South is a forum from which global concerns are being voiced, not in the old-fashioned way. In a multipolar world, the alignment should be from the prospects of what is required in the future. Technology is required. India has shown scaling up technologies is simply done easily within the context of India, which is a large democracy. Similar is the need for technology in many of the global South countries. And one common factor for mastering technology is Japan and India have common friends. Common friend being Taiwan. In mastering technology and in taking that technology forward for the benefit of not just a large population like India, but it's a skilled, aspirational population. And there are populations which need the technology for global good. Isn't this cause enough for Japan to work together with India to reach the global South? Equally, I think the parts of India and Japan which are common for global good for as global commons, the Indian Ocean region, that part of the Pacific, the South China Sea. We have such an important position, geo position, which we cannot forget. If we hold together both the economy and the strategic interests, we are giving the world the stable commons, which is so required for global trade. And nearly 40% of the global trade moves in these waters. If India, together with Japan, can take technology to these regions and to the global south, you're giving the world that engine with such a power that it can lead the world's growth, that it can lead the world's trade. And therefore, I think technology for the global commons that we share, and also the common interest that we have as India and Japan to reach out to those parts of the world which so is dependent on countries like us for these very big advantages point for this century. So I think there's so much that India and Japan can work together. And between India and Japan, other than just the government, I think what needs to be sustained is the people to people and business to business interest, which is what I think your forum is doing. One argument which I'll put forth for just as a thought, I'm not talking about Government of India's position. Relationships between countries remain at a stable level despite some ups and downs when people to people and business to business contacts are safe, when they are strong, when they're deepened, and that they are frequently maintained. There can be political ups and downs, but when people to people, business to business contacts are absolutely strong, relationship remains strong. And I would very much call for Japan and India to build on these strengths as well.
Well, thank you very much, Finance Minister. Thank you for answering questions over a wide range of issues, domestic, regional, international, and ending on that optimistic note that people-to-people contact embedded in abiding friendship and trust is what nations are all about. Thank you very much for having spared your time.